As of this morning, the U.S. border with Mexico is still open, despite President Trump's threat to close it. So will he make good on that threat? At this point, kind of anybody's guess. Senior Trump advisor Stephen Miller says the border status depends on just how much help the U.S. gets from Central and South America to prevent an onslaught of what he called meritless asylum claims, while other White House officials say closing the southern border would be catastrophic. Joining me now, Democratic Congressman Adriano Espaillat of New York, who recently traveled to Colombia, El Salvador, and Mexico as part of a congressional delegation there. Sir, good to have you with us. These are conflicting messages that we're getting from the White House here, but Stephen Miller, CNN can now report, telling supporters the president may not, in fact, close the border. What's your reaction to that?
Well, that's a wise decision. I think closing the border would not only hurt, but perhaps help cripple the economy in some of our border states. But, you know, yesterday, Erica, I met with President Lopez Obrador, and he's very enthusiastic about creating what he called curtains of economic development. Reforestation for the Chiapas state in the southern border of Mexico, a rail line in the Maya coast, and going in the northern border, all of which will create jobs in Mexico and reduce the migration. In fact, the migration folks going back to Mexico are less than 12% Mexicans. The real issue of immigration is not even any longer in El Salvador, who's seen a 50% drop in homicides. It's really about Honduras and Guatemala. So we should do in Honduras and Guatemala what we've done in El Salvador, where we've seen a young president, Bukele, implement and run on ending corruption and ending violence, and we see some major progress there. And that's what we should be focusing in, the root cause of these migration patterns.
So is that the message that you're bringing back, and is that a message that you're going to share with the White House?
That's the message that I'm bringing back. To cut funding for the Triangle countries will be devastating. I met with FBI agents and law enforcement agents on the ground in El Salvador who will be compromised. In fact, we may put their lives in danger if we cut the funding. I met with young men that were in programs to deter them from joining gangs. And I've seen people looking forward to get jobs in El Salvador. These are the kinds of things that we should be doing in Guatemala and Honduras. This is the efforts that have reduced migration in El Salvador. They should also work in Guatemala and Honduras. And of course, shutting the border will create chaos not only in the United States, but also in Mexico. By the way, the new El Salvadorian president is looking to review their new agreement, their recent agreement with China. So if we leave a vacuum, believe me, China will step in and take full control of that vacuum of leadership.
There's been a lot more talk about the economic impacts. Bringing China into the mix certainly raises ears and makes people perk up a little bit. You talk about some of the efforts in Mexico, in Central America. What about efforts here, though, in the U.S.? I mean, you were very candid last night with my colleague, Chris Cuomo, in talking about the need for hearings to deal with this. There aren't any. The need for comprehensive immigration reform. And you told Chris that it's not a winning poll issue. Is that how things is that how lawmakers are governing these days, based on what will and will not win at the polls?
Well, I'm glad to see that hearings will be called next week on the issue of shutting down the border and cutting help to the Triangle countries. I think that this is a smart hearing. It will get to the root of the problem. As I said, nobody likes to leave their homeland unless they're fearing violence, unless they don't have a job. And of course, poverty and unemployment are deeply connected to violence. And so no one likes to leave their home country, their families behind, and come to a new adventure, if you may, unless they're facing violence, deep unemployment, unless they've been hurt by a natural disaster. So having hearings on these issues, which are the root causes of migration, is a smart thing to do. Now, acting on polls, I've always been against it. I think that this is a humanitarian crisis, and if someone is not motivated to do the right thing when they see a mom and her 3-year-old baby sleeping on a cold floor of a cell, looking like packed like sardines, like the bottom deck of a slave ship, I don't know what will motivate you.
We will look for more of that then. I do want to get your take, too. You know, there's been a lot of back and forth, specifically this week, even just yesterday. Democrats, in voting on this bill, not happy about the amount of money being allocated for food stamps in Puerto Rico. Republicans not happy about a lack of flooding for Midwestern funding. When we look at disaster relief efforts, when we look at funding, it has become such a partisan political issue. This can't be winning for any politician. How do you get beyond that? When does it stop?
Well, I don't think it should be a partisan issue. I think that Puerto Rico needs funding. Of course, if you look at the patterns of funding, in fact, if you look at the personnel, the emergency personnel that got to Puerto Rico versus Florida versus Texas, you will see a disparity there. I have a piece of legislation that will do away with all the bureaucratic tie-up that often makes it impossible for someone to get, let's say, funding, a grant to fix their roof. And this would apply not only to Puerto Rico, it will apply to any area that has been hit by a natural disaster. These are the kinds of issues that we should be working on.
Congressman, we appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.